Captain Jake Morrison stood at the window of his ship and watched the alien vessel approach through the darkness of space. His hands were shaking, but he tried to hide it from his crew. This was the moment humanity had waited for across centuries of wondering if they were alone in the universe. The alien ship looked nothing like human vessels. It was made of something that glowed with soft blue light and seemed almost alive as it moved through the void between stars. Dr. Lisa. Chen could barely contain her excitement as she adjusted the sensors for the 100th time. She had dreamed of this since she was a child, reading about the possibilities of life beyond Earth. Now here it was, real and approaching their ship. The other crew members were gathered on the bridge, each trying to look calm and professional while their hearts raced with anticipation and fear. The aliens had called themselves the Voranth in their first transmission. Their language had been translated by computers, but something about the way they spoke seemed odd to Morrison. There were long pauses between words, as if they were carefully choosing each one. When they finally docked with the human ship, the airlock opened with a hiss that made everyone jump. The Voranth who entered were tall and thin, their bodies covered in skin that looked like frosted glass. Through this transparent skin, Morrison could see what might have been organs or perhaps light flowing through their bodies. Their faces had large, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The leader stepped forward and spoke through a device that hung around what passed for its neck. Ambassador Kael'thar introduced himself with words that came out stilted and formal through the translator. Morrison welcomed them aboard and began the tour of the ship that had been planned for weeks. Everything seemed to be going well at first. The Voranth examined human technology with what looked like interest. They asked questions about Earth and human history. But as the hours passed, Morrison noticed something strange. The Voranth kept flinching at small things. When Lieutenant Danny Carter made a joke about the food in the cafeteria, all 3 Voranth visitors jerked backward as if struck. When Engineer Sophie Blake started humming while checking a power coupling, they covered the sides of their heads where their ears might have been. Kael'thar's movements became more agitated with each passing hour. Morrison pulled Lisa aside during a break in the tour. "Something is wrong," he whispered. They looked terrified. Lisa had noticed it too. She had been watching the Voranth carefully and saw how they seemed to be in pain whenever humans were near them. But why would simple proximity cause such distress? They were breathing the same air without problem. The temperature was comfortable for both species. What could be hurting them? The answer came suddenly and without warning. Lisa had been thinking through a list of questions she wanted to ask the Voranth about their biology. She hadn't spoken any of these thoughts aloud. But Kael'thar suddenly turned to her with those huge dark eyes and spoke in a voice that trembled with something close to panic. "Please stop. The noise. Your minds are so loud," Morrison didn't understand. "What noise?" The ship was running quietly. All the alarms and warning systems were silent. The crew was speaking in normal voices. But Kael'thar wasn't talking about sound that ears could hear. He was talking about something else entirely, something that humans didn't even know they were doing. The Voranth were telepathic. They could hear thoughts the way humans could hear voices. And human thoughts, it turned out, were nothing like the thoughts of other species in the galaxy. Every species the Voranth had met before possessed something they called mental discipline. Their thoughts were controlled, organized, quiet. But humans were different in a way that the Voranth found horrifying. Human minds never stopped broadcasting. While Lisa was standing there trying to understand what Kael'thar meant, her mind was simultaneously thinking about the questions she wanted to ask, remembering a conversation with her daughter that morning, wondering if she had locked her apartment door back on Earth, and humming a song she had heard on the radio last week. All of this happening at once, all of it leaking out into the mental space around her like noise from a broken speaker. Kael'thar tried to explain, but the effort seemed to be causing him physical pain. "Your species thinks in layers, multiple streams of consciousness all happening simultaneously. You think about one thing while remembering another, while planning a third, while feeling emotions about a fourth. For us, for all telepathic species, this is unbearable. It is like standing next to a machine that screams without ever pausing for breath." Morrison felt a cold weight settling into his stomach. They had prepared for so many possibilities for first contact. Language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, even potential conflicts over resources or territory. But nobody had prepared for this. Nobody had even considered that the simple act of human thinking might be painful to aliens. The other Voranth were clearly in distress now. One of them had fallen to its knees, its transparent skin flickering with colors that might have indicated pain or fear. Kael'thar backed toward the airlock, his movements jerky and desperate. "We must leave, immediately. Being near your kind is causing damage to our minds. We cannot stay here any longer." Lisa stepped forward, trying to help, but Kael'thar recoiled from her approach as if she carried a deadly disease. Morrison ordered everyone to move back and give the Voranth space to retreat. The crew watched in stunned silence as their visitors fled back to their ship like refugees escaping a disaster. Before the airlock sealed, Kael'thar delivered one final message. His voice through the translator was barely controlled, shaking with effort and fear. "We will report this to the Galactic Council. They must know that humanity exists. They must know what you are. In 10,000 years of traveling the stars, we have never encountered a species like yours. Your minds are weapons that you cannot control. You are dangerous in ways you do not understand." The Voranth ship detached and disappeared into faster-than-light travel, leaving the human crew standing in shocked silence. Morrison looked around at his people and saw his own confusion and fear reflected in their faces. Lisa was crying quietly, her dreams of peaceful contact with aliens shattered. Danny Carter sat down heavily, his usual jokes forgotten. Sophie Blake stared at the empty airlock as if she could will the Voranth to come back and tell them it was all a misunderstanding. But it wasn't a misunderstanding. Humanity had just made first contact with an alien species, and it had failed not because of aggression or hostility, but because of something far more fundamental. Human minds worked differently than every other species in the galaxy. The thoughts that humans took for granted, the mental multitasking that allowed them to be creative and adaptable, was apparently a form of psychological warfare to telepathic species. Morrison sat down at the communications console and began composing a message to Earth. "How did you explain something like this? How did you tell your entire species that they had been rejected by aliens not for what they did, but for what they were? The very nature of human consciousness, the thing that made people human, was incompatible with the rest of the galaxy." As the crew began the long journey back to Earth, Lisa stood at the window watching the stars. She was still thinking in multiple layers, still processing thoughts and memories and emotions all at once. But now she was aware of it in a way she had never been before. She was aware that this natural human ability, this chaos of consciousness that no human could turn off, had just made her species outcasts before they even had a chance to introduce themselves properly to the universe. And somewhere out there, the Voranth were traveling to their homeworlds, carrying news that would spread across the galaxy like wildfire, news of a species whose minds screamed without stopping, whose thoughts were weapons they couldn't control, whose very consciousness was a threat to every telepathic civilization that might encounter them. Humanity had finally found proof that they weren't alone in the universe, only to discover that the universe wished they would just be quiet. 6 months passed before Earth heard from the aliens again. Admiral Grace Holland sat in the command center watching the holographic display as the message came through from something called the Galactic Council. The transmission was formal and cold, delivered by a creature that looked like it had too many legs and glowed with strange colors. The message itself was worse than anyone had feared. Humanity was being quarantined. No human ship would be allowed to leave the solar system. No alien vessel would approach Earth. The reason given was psychic contamination. The Voranth had reported their encounter to the Council, and the Council had decided that humanity was too dangerous to be allowed into galactic civilization. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was something worse. It was rejection. Dr. Nathan Ross assembled a team of scientists to understand what made human minds different. They spent months studying brain patterns, consciousness, and the nature of human thought. What they discovered was both simple and profound. Human brains had evolved to process multiple streams of information simultaneously. While thinking about one problem, humans could also remember past experiences, imagine future possibilities, and feel complex emotions about all of it at once. This parallel processing was what made humans creative. It was why humans could look at a problem from multiple angles simultaneously. It was why human art and music and literature were so rich and complex. But to species that had evolved with telepathy, this same trait was overwhelming. It was like trying to listen to 100 radio stations all playing at once through speakers that never turned off. Commander Ryan Cole refused to accept the quarantine. He was a military officer who believed that humanity deserved its place among the stars regardless of what the aliens thought. He began gathering volunteers for a mission that everyone knew was probably suicidal. They would break through the blockade that the Galactic Council had placed around the solar system. They would prove that humans couldn't be contained. The ship they built was called Defiant, and the name was chosen deliberately. Pilot Amy Chen spent months training on simulators, learning how to fly using alien technology that had been reverse-engineered from the Vorinth scanner data. Navigator Victor Price mapped courses through the blockade, looking for weaknesses in the automated defense systems. Engineer Laura Bennett worked day and night to make sure every system would function perfectly when they needed it most. The night before launch, Cole gathered his crew and told them the truth. They probably wouldn't come back. The alien satellites surrounding the solar system were programmed to destroy any human vessel that tried to leave. The weapons those satellites carried could vaporize their ship in seconds. But if they succeeded, if they somehow made it through, they would prove that humanity couldn't be imprisoned by fear. Launch day came cold and gray. The Defiant slipped away from Earth's orbital stations without authorization, heading for the outer reaches of the solar system where the blockade waited. As they approached, the alien satellites activated exactly as predicted. Their weapons locked onto the Defiant and prepared to fire. Amy Chen's hands were steady on the controls even though her heart was racing. Victor Price watched the navigation displays and called out distances in a voice that didn't shake. Laura Bennett monitored every system, ready to make repairs if anything failed. But something unexpected happened. The satellites were designed to interface with the minds of the ships they encountered. They would scan for hostile intent, check identification, and verify authorization. These systems worked perfectly with every other species in the galaxy, because those species had mental discipline. Their thoughts were organized and controllable. But when the satellites tried to scan the Defiant, they encountered something they weren't built to handle. Amy was thinking about flight trajectories while simultaneously remembering a song her mother used to sing. Victor was calculating jump coordinates while worrying about whether he had sent that message to his sister. Laura was monitoring engine temperatures while mentally composing a letter she wanted to write to her children. All of this mental noise, all of this chaotic human consciousness, flooded into the satellite systems at once. The satellites couldn't process it. Their artificial intelligence systems, built to handle the clean, organized thoughts of telepathic species, simply shut down when faced with the overwhelming chaos of human minds. One by one, the satellites went dark, their weapons powering down, their systems overwhelmed by something they had no defense against. The Defiant flew through the blockade without firing a single shot. Cole sat back in his command chair and started laughing. It was a laugh of relief and amazement and triumph all mixed together. They had done it. They had broken through using nothing but the thing the aliens feared most about humanity. The very trait that had gotten humans quarantined was the same trait that had set them free. The celebration was short-lived. Long-range sensors detected ships approaching fast. The Galactic Council had sent an enforcement fleet, led by a species called the Krellians. Unlike the Vorinth, the Krellians weren't telepathic. They were warriors, pure and simple, and they had orders to bring the Defiant back by any means necessary. Cole knew they couldn't win a straight fight. The Krellian ships were bigger, faster, and better armed. The first battle happened near Proxima Centauri. The Krellian fleet came at them in perfect military formation, their tactics predictable and precise. Cole ordered Amy to fly in patterns that made no sense, random movements that followed no doctrine or standard procedure. Victor fed her coordinates that changed every few seconds based on nothing but intuition and guesswork. Laura rerouted power systems in ways that no engineer would normally consider, making the ship behave unpredictably. The Krellians tried to anticipate the Defiant's movements, but how could you anticipate chaos? Every time they set up to intercept, the human ship was somewhere else doing something unexpected. The Krellian commanders, trained in standard military tactics, couldn't adapt fast enough. Their ships collided with each other trying to chase a target that refused to behave logically. But the Krellians had telepathic crew members handling communications and coordination. When those crew members tried to monitor the Defiant's intentions, they got hit with the same overwhelming mental noise that had shut down the satellites. The telepathic officers collapsed at their stations, overwhelmed by the chaotic broadcast of human consciousness. The Krellian fleet's coordination fell apart as their communication network failed. The Defiant didn't destroy the Krellian ships. They didn't need to. The enemy fleet was already defeating itself, confused and disoriented by an opponent they couldn't predict or understand. Commander Zix of the Krellian Empire sent a message before retreating. You fight without honor or discipline. You have no strategy, no order. How can we defeat an enemy that doesn't even know what it will do next? Cole transmitted a response that would become famous throughout the galaxy. We're not trying to defeat you with strategy or discipline. We're just being ourselves. And if being ourselves is enough to confuse your mighty fleet, maybe the problem isn't with us. News of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. The species that was supposed to be quarantined had not only escaped, but had defeated a council enforcement fleet without destroying a single ship. The implications terrified the galactic powers. If one human ship could do this, what could an entire fleet do? What could humanity accomplish if they were ever allowed to truly expand into space? Back on Earth, Admiral Holland received Cole's report with mixed feelings. On one hand, they had proven that humanity couldn't be contained. On the other hand, they had also proven that humanity was exactly as dangerous as the aliens feared. The chaotic human mind wasn't just incompatible with galactic civilization. It was a weapon that could disrupt every system the aliens had built. The Defiant continued deeper into space, knowing they could never return home. The Council would be hunting them now, and Earth would face consequences for what they had done. But Cole didn't regret it. Standing on the bridge of his ship, looking at stars that no human had ever seen before, he felt something that he couldn't quite name. It was freedom mixed with defiance mixed with pride. Humanity had been told to be quiet, to stay hidden, to accept their isolation. Instead, they had screamed their presence across the galaxy and dared anyone to try and silence them. Amy plotted their next jump, her mind already wandering to thoughts of what they might find in the next system. Victor checked their supplies while mentally replaying conversations he wished he had finished before leaving Earth. Laura monitored the engines while humming a tune that had been stuck in her head for days. All of them thinking in layers, processing multiple streams of consciousness simultaneously, their minds broadcasting chaos into the void around them, and for the first time, none of them wanted to apologize for it. Dr. Nathan Ross made his breakthrough on a Tuesday morning while drinking bad coffee and staring at brain scans. For months, he had been trying to understand how human consciousness worked differently from alien minds. Now, watching the patterns of neural activity scroll across his screens, he finally understood. Humans couldn't turn off their mental noise, but they could learn to direct it like a conductor directing an orchestra. He called in Dr. Karen Ellis, a psychologist who specialized in meditation and mental training. Together with computer scientist Marcus Webb, they developed protocols that taught humans to weaponize their chaos deliberately. It wasn't about achieving silence or discipline. It was about taking the natural multi-layered thinking that humans did automatically and turning it into something purposeful. The first volunteers were military personnel who understood that they were learning to use their own minds as weapons. Captain Julia Morgan led the training program, and she was good at it. She could think about tactical problems while simultaneously broadcasting random memories and emotions that would confuse any telepathic scanner trying to read her intentions. Her students learned to do the same, each finding their own way to amplify and direct the mental chaos that came naturally to humans. Communications specialist Henry Liu could fill the mental space around him with overlapping conversations, song lyrics, and mathematical calculations all at once. Tactical officer Nicole Wright learned to broadcast fear and confidence simultaneously, creating emotional static that disrupted telepathic attempts to predict her actions. Systems engineer Brandon Cole discovered he could think about engine specifications while remembering childhood games while planning dinner, creating a wall of mundane thoughts that hid his actual intentions. They called themselves the Noise Brigade, and their first mission was to make contact with species that the Galactic Council had enslaved. Throughout the galaxy, there were dozens of non-telepathic species who had been conquered and forced into servitude. These species couldn't communicate through telepathy, so they were treated as inferior beings. The Council claimed they were bringing civilization to primitive worlds, but it was just slavery with better public relations. The Defiant had been joined by 3 more human vessels that had escaped Earth's quarantine using the same technique of overwhelming the automated defenses. Commander Cole's small fleet now traveled through Council space, seeking out the oppressed and offering them hope. The first world they liberated was called Tarkos III, home to an amphibious species that had been enslaved for 3 generations. The Tarkosians couldn't speak with their mouths, instead communicating through patterns of bioluminescence on their skin. The telepathic overseers who controlled their world had never bothered to learn this language, simply forcing the Tarkosians to obey through mental commands that caused pain when disobeyed. Captain Morgan's team arrived with a plan that was simple and devastating. 20 human operatives landed on Tarkos III and simply walked toward the main control facility where the overseers coordinated their mental domination of the planet. They didn't carry weapons. They didn't need to. As they approached, all 20 of them unleashed their minds at full volume. Every random thought, every memory, every emotion, every bit of mental noise they could generate. The telepathic overseers had never experienced anything like it. They were used to the clean, organized thoughts of telepathic species or the simple mental patterns of animals. But 20 human minds all broadcasting chaos simultaneously was like being hit by a psychic tsunami. The overseers collapsed, their mental control over the planet's systems failing as they writhed in telepathic agony. The Tarkosians rose up in revolution while their captors were incapacitated. Within hours, they had taken control of their own world for the first time in living memory. The humans taught them how to use the technology the overseers had left behind. More importantly, they taught them that being non-telepathic wasn't a weakness. It was just a different way of existing, neither better nor worse than telepathy. News of the liberation spread through the underground networks that connected oppressed species across the galaxy. Humans weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had been marginalized by the telepathic powers that dominated galactic civilization. More species reached out asking for help, offering alliance, wanting to learn from these strange, loud-minded beings who had turned their supposed weakness into strength. Engineer Peter Santos worked with representatives from liberated worlds to develop new communication devices. These devices could translate between telepathic and non-telepathic species without causing the overwhelming feedback that standard systems created. Medical officer Dr. Claire Adams studied how different species experienced human mental presence, finding ways to minimize discomfort for telepaths who wanted to work with humans peacefully. But the Galactic Council wasn't going to accept this challenge to their authority without a fight. They assembled something they called the Grand Armada, a fleet of over 5,000 ships representing every major military power in Council space. Their target was obvious: Earth itself. If they couldn't contain humanity through quarantine, they would eliminate the threat at its source. Admiral Holland received intelligence about the Armada's formation 3 weeks before it would arrive at Earth. 3 weeks to prepare for a battle that humanity couldn't possibly win through conventional means. The Earth Defense Fleet had maybe 1,000 ships, most of them built hastily in the year since the quarantine began. Against 5,000 Council warships, the numbers were hopeless. But Holland had an idea that was either brilliant or insane. Instead of preparing a military defense, she put out a call for civilian volunteers. Anyone with a ship, no matter how small, no matter how unsuited for combat. Anyone who had gone through mental training and learned to weaponize their thoughts. The response was overwhelming. Within 2 weeks, 10,000 civilian vessels had gathered around Earth, ready to defend their home world with the only weapon that mattered. The pilots of these ships were teachers and factory workers and scientists and artists. They were parents and students and retirees. None of them were soldiers, but all of them had learned what it meant to turn their chaotic human minds into shields and swords. They formed a defensive sphere around Earth, waiting for the Armada to arrive. When the Grand Armada entered the solar system, their commanders expected an easy victory. They saw the civilian ships and laughed at the pathetic defense humanity had mounted. What could teachers and factory workers do against trained warriors in military vessels? But the commanders didn't understand what they were facing until it was too late. The humans didn't fire weapons. They simply broadcast their thoughts. 10,000 minds all unleashing their natural chaos at maximum volume. 10,000 people thinking about their families while remembering songs, while worrying about bills, while planning tomorrow's dinner, while feeling fear and hope and anger and love all at the same time. The mental noise was deafening in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Across the Grand Armada, telepathic crew members collapsed at their stations. Ships that relied on telepathic interfaces for targeting and navigation found their systems failing. Even the non-telepathic Krellian warriors discovered their weapons malfunctioning as the mental static bled through every networked system. The carefully coordinated attack formation fell apart into chaos. Admiral Holland broadcast a message to the Armada's commander. Her voice was calm but firm, the voice of someone who had stopped apologizing for what she was. "You came here to silence us, but silence is the one thing humans can never achieve. We tried to be peaceful, we tried to be quiet. But if you force us to be loud, we will be deafening. Leave now, or face the full power of a species that has learned to weaponize its own nature." The Grand Armada retreated, not because they were defeated militarily, but because they were defeated psychologically. They had come to fight an enemy they understood, but instead they found something that broke every assumption they had about warfare and consciousness and power. 10,000 civilian volunteers had defended Earth without firing a shot, simply by being themselves as loudly as possible. In the aftermath, as the civilian ships returned to their normal lives, people across Earth began to understand something profound. The galaxy had feared them for being unable to quiet their minds, but that inability was not a curse. It was the very thing that made them free. Telepathic species could have their thoughts read, their intentions predicted, their minds controlled. But humans were too chaotic to control, too unpredictable to anticipate, too loud to silence. And that, more than any weapon or technology, was what made them strong. The failure of the Grand Armada sent shockwaves through the Galactic Council that would change their civilization forever. For 10,000 years, the Council had maintained order through telepathic unity and military might. Now, for the first time, their authority was being questioned by their own member species. If they couldn't contain or defeat humanity, what did that say about their power? The Council fractured into factions that disagreed fundamentally about what to do with the human problem. The isolationists, led by the Vorinth, wanted complete separation. Build a barrier around human space and never interact with them again. Let them have their corner of the galaxy, but contain them absolutely. The assimilationists, led by the Threxians, believed humans could be taught telepathic discipline given enough time and proper instruction. They saw humanity as a species that could be civilized if approached correctly. But the most dangerous faction was the militarists, led by Commander Zix of the Krellian Empire. Zix had lost too many battles to the humans. He had been humiliated, his tactics defeated by chaos and unpredictability. Now he argued that the only solution was complete eradication. Humanity wasn't a problem to be solved or contained. They were a disease that needed to be eliminated before it spread further. Earth's intelligence networks had expanded dramatically in the year since breaking the quarantine. Director Alan Foster coordinated with field agents scattered across dozens of worlds, gathering information about Council military movements. Operative Rachel Green worked undercover on a Threxian colony world, monitoring communications. Analyst Kevin Price sifted through intercepted transmissions, looking for patterns that might indicate where the next attack would come from. What they discovered was terrifying. Zix wasn't just planning another attack. He was gathering allies among non-telepathic and telepathically immune species, building a fleet specifically designed to counter human mental abilities. This fleet would have no telepathic systems for humans to disrupt. Every ship would be shielded, every crew member either non-telepathic or equipped with technology that blocked mental interference. It was a purification fleet, and its only purpose was genocide. But humanity wasn't alone anymore. The Tarkosians, freed from slavery, had become Earth's first true allies. Their leader, Elder Morna, spoke before what remained of the Galactic Council with words that many species had been thinking but were afraid to voice. "You fear humans because they are different, because they do not conform to your telepathic order, but I have lived among them. I have experienced their chaotic minds, and I tell you that their chaos is not a weakness. It is freedom itself expressed in thought." Other species began reaching out to Earth with offers of alliance. The Dulrathi were silicon-based beings who communicated through vibrations and had always been treated as second-class citizens by telepathic species. They saw in humanity a kindred spirit, another species that didn't fit the telepathic mold. The Vex were a hive-minded species that operated on completely different principles than individual telepathy. They found human mental patterns fascinating rather than frightening, seeing in human chaos a reflection of their own collective consciousness. Ambassador Patricia Lee worked tirelessly to formalize these alliances into something lasting. working with Cultural Liaison Officer Carlos Martinez and Trade Negotiator Helen Brooks. She helped create what would become the Free Species Alliance. It was an organization dedicated to protecting the rights of all sentient beings, regardless of how their minds worked. For the first time in galactic history, telepathic supremacy was being challenged not by another telepathic power, but by a coalition of the different. While diplomacy progressed, military preparations accelerated. Intelligence indicated that Zix had assembled 30,000 ships, all equipped with the latest anti-telepathic shielding. The fleet would arrive at Earth within 3 months. Admiral Holland knew that the defensive tactics that had worked against the Grand Armada wouldn't work this time. The enemy had adapted. Humanity would need to adapt too. Engineer Laura Bennett led a team developing new weapon systems that didn't rely on mental interference. Instead, they focused on unpredictability as a tactical advantage. Missiles that changed course randomly, energy weapons that fired in patterns no computer could predict. Defense shields that fluctuated according to human intuition rather than programmed algorithms. If the enemy had prepared to fight mental chaos, humanity would fight with physical chaos instead. The Battle of Sol began on a Tuesday morning when sensors detected the massive purification fleet entering the system. 30,000 warships moved in perfect formation, their approach calculated to overwhelm any defense. Admiral Holland commanded from the dreadnought Unity, a massive vessel built with combined human and Tarkosian technology. Captain Cole led fast attack squadrons that would use hit-and-run tactics. Captain Morgan commanded the expanded Noise Brigade, though everyone knew mental attacks would be less effective this time. The first wave of Krellian ships tore through human defenses with brutal efficiency. Their shielding worked perfectly, blocking mental interference while their weapons cut through human vessels like they were made of paper. For every Krellian ship destroyed, 3 human ships were lost. The tactical displays showed the grim mathematics of defeat. At this rate, Earth's defenses would collapse within hours. But Commander Zix had made one critical miscalculation. He had prepared his fleet to fight humans. He hadn't prepared them to fight the Free Species Alliance. Tarkosian ships emerged from behind Jupiter's moons, their sonic weapons specifically designed to penetrate Krellian armor. Dulrathi vessels, moving through space like living asteroids, crashed into enemy formations with devastating kinetic force. Vex fighters operated as a true hive mind, coordinating attacks that no individual commander could counter. And the humans adapted in ways that Zix couldn't have anticipated. Laura Bennett's random weapon systems proved devastatingly effective. Krellian targeting computers designed to predict trajectories based on physics and logic couldn't track missiles that changed course for no logical reason. Human pilots made decisions based on instinct and intuition, doing things that made no tactical sense but somehow worked anyway. The battle raged for 18 hours. Space around Earth became a graveyard of broken ships from both sides. Thousands died on both sides. Each death a tragedy regardless of which species they belonged to. But slowly and possibly the momentum shifted. The Krellian fleet's perfect. Coordination began breaking down as they faced enemies that refused to behave predictably. Commander Zix watched his carefully, planned attack fall apart and made a decision. Born of desperation and rage, he would personally lead a strike directly at Earth itself, ignoring the defending fleet. If he could destroy humanity's home world, the victory would still be his. He gathered his remaining flagships and punched through the defensive line, heading straight for the blue planet below. The Defiant, Cole's original ship that had started this whole conflict, intercepted Zix's flagship. The small human vessel was no match for the massive Krellian dreadnought in a straight fight. But Cole wasn't planning a straight fight. He had loaded the Defiant with every explosive the engineers could fit, turning his ship into a massive bomb. His crew had evacuated to other vessels. He was alone on the bridge, thinking about his children back on Earth as he aimed his ship at the enemy flagship. Cole's last transmission was simple. For everyone who was told they didn't belong. For every species that was marginalized or enslaved. For everyone who was told to be quiet when they wanted to scream. This is for you. The Defiant crashed into Zix's flagship at maximum velocity, the explosion tearing both ships apart. The Krellian commander died instantly, his dreams of purification dying with him. Without their commander, the purification fleet's resolve broke. Ships began retreating individually, their coordinated attack dissolving into chaos. Within an hour, the battle was over. Earth had survived, but the cost was staggering. Thousands of ships destroyed, tens of thousands dead. Cole's sacrifice had turned the tide, but victory felt hollow when measured against the losses. Admiral Holland stood on the bridge of the Unity, looking at the debris field that surrounded Earth. She thought about Cole, about all the people who had died defending humanity's right to exist. They had proven that humans could be beaten by conventional military force. But they had also proven something more important. Humans would never stop fighting for freedom, no matter the cost, and they wouldn't fight alone. The Free Species Alliance had proven that diversity was strength, that different forms of consciousness could work together against tyranny. The galaxy would never be the same. The Galactic Council's authority was broken. New voices were demanding representation, and at the center of this galactic revolution was humanity, the species that couldn't be quiet, wouldn't be contained, and refused to apologize for being different. The battle for Sol was over, but the battle for a new galactic order was just beginning. The years following the Battle of Sol brought changes that nobody could have predicted. The old Galactic Council dissolved itself within 6 months, unable to maintain authority after their crushing defeat. In its place, something new began to emerge. Not a government built on telepathic unity, but a federation that recognized the rights of all sentient species, regardless of how their minds worked. Dr. Nathan Ross continued his research into consciousness, but now he had help from telepathic species who had overcome their fear of human minds. Working together, they made discoveries that changed how both humans and aliens understood thought itself. Human mental chaos wasn't just random noise, it was complexity, the ability to process multiple streams of information simultaneously. This parallel processing was what made humans creative problem solvers and innovative thinkers. The research revealed something fascinating. Every species in the galaxy had evolved some form of mental efficiency, ways of thinking that minimized cognitive load. Telepathic species had developed mental discipline to avoid overwhelming each other. Hive minds had developed collective processing to distribute cognitive burden. But humans, evolving in isolation from any telepathic network, had developed something different. They had developed the ability to maintain multiple conscious processes simultaneously, without it causing psychological collapse. Dr. Monica Davis, a linguist who specialized in nonverbal communication, worked with Vorinth scholars to develop new translation protocols. These protocols created a middle ground between telepathic and non-telepathic communication. Humans could learn to focus their thoughts when interacting with telepaths, not silencing their minds but organizing the chaos enough to be tolerable. Telepaths could learn to filter and process human mental patterns without pain, treating human consciousness like a complex language rather than an assault. The breakthrough came when they realized that human consciousness was similar to music. To someone who had never heard music, an orchestra would sound like overwhelming noise. But to someone who understood musical structure, that same orchestra became a symphony. Human thoughts were like that. Chaotic to the unprepared, but potentially beautiful to those who learned to perceive the patterns within the chaos. On the red sands of Mars, representatives from 47 species gathered for the Treaty of Mars Conference. The negotiations lasted 3 months and sometimes became heated, but eventually a framework emerged that would govern the new galactic order. Ambassador Patricia Lee represented humanity, her voice steady as she argued for principles that had once seemed impossible to achieve. The treaty established several key principles that would reshape galactic civilization. First, no species would be forced to conform to a single standard of consciousness. Telepathic, non-telepathic, hive-minded, or any other form of sentience would have equal legal standing. Second, technology would be developed to protect telepathic species from unwanted mental contact, while respecting the rights of all species to exist freely. Third, all previously enslaved or marginalized species would be granted full citizenship and compensation for past injustices. But the most important principle was one that humanity insisted upon absolutely: the right to remain different. Humans would not be required to learn telepathic discipline. They would not be forced to quiet their minds. They had earned the right to be exactly what they were, and that right extended to every species. Diversity of consciousness was not a problem to be solved, but a strength to be celebrated. Admiral Holland stood beside Kael'thar of the Vorinth during the treaty signing. The Voranth ambassador who had fled from human contact years ago had returned, transformed by experience and understanding. Through the new translation systems that allowed comfortable communication between their species, Kalthar spoke words that would be remembered throughout galactic history. "We were wrong to fear you. We saw only noise and did not recognize the music. We saw only chaos and did not see the creativity within it. We judged you by our standards and did not consider that different standards might have equal value." 20 years after first contact, humanity had spread across dozens of worlds. Human colonies existed in systems that had once been forbidden to them. But these weren't colonies built on conquest or domination. They were communities built on cooperation, with humans living alongside aliens of every description. Children grew up speaking multiple languages, some verbal and some telepathic, learning to navigate between different forms of consciousness as easily as switching between topics. The Noise Brigade had transformed from a military unit into a peacekeeping force. Captain Morgan, now a general, led missions that prevented conflicts rather than fighting them. When tensions arose between species, human negotiators could use their unique mental abilities to disrupt hostile telepathic coordination while simultaneously offering genuine paths to peace. The ability that had once made humans feared now made them valuable as mediators and peacekeepers. Human creativity and innovation had revitalized galactic technology. Scientists and engineers from Earth worked alongside alien colleagues to make breakthroughs in everything from medical technology to faster-than-light travel. The human tendency toward unconventional thinking, the willingness to try approaches that seemed illogical, led to solutions that telepathic species would never have considered. Dr. Lisa Chen, now elderly but still sharp, published her final research paper. She titled it simply, "The Symphony of Chaos," and in it she argued that humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy wasn't technology or military strength. It was the example they provided. For 10,000 years, galactic civilization had operated under the assumption that there was one correct way for consciousness to work. Humanity proved that assumption wrong, and in proving it wrong, they freed countless other species to embrace their own differences without shame. The Free Species Alliance grew into the largest political organization in known space, representing hundreds of worlds and dozens of species. It operated on principles that would have been revolutionary before humanity arrived. Decisions were made by consensus rather than telepathic unity. Diversity was actively encouraged rather than merely tolerated. Different forms of consciousness were treated as equally valid rather than ranked in a hierarchy. Ambassador Lee, now in her 70s, gave a speech at the dedication of the first joint human-alien university. She stood before a crowd that included humans and Voranth, Krellians and Tarkosians, former enemies now working together toward a common future. Her voice was strong despite her age, carrying the weight of all that humanity had fought for and achieved. They feared us because our minds wouldn't stay quiet. They feared us because we were different, because we didn't fit their understanding of how consciousness should work. But fear is born from ignorance, and ignorance dies in the light of understanding. We didn't conquer the galaxy. We didn't force anyone to think like us. We simply refused to be silenced. And in refusing, we showed the galaxy that there is strength in diversity, power in difference, and beauty in chaos. 50 years after first contact, a young woman named Emma Morrison stood on the observation deck of the Explorers Academy, watching ships from 100 different species arrive and depart. She was the granddaughter of Captain Jake Morrison, and she had grown up in a galaxy that her grandfather had helped create. To her, the idea that humans were once feared seemed absurd, like a story from ancient history rather than something that had happened within living memory. Her best friend was a young Voranth named Lyra, who found human mental patterns fascinating rather than frightening. Her instructors included Krellians, Tarkosians, Threxians, and dozens of other species, all working together to train the next generation of explorers. The old barriers between telepathic and non-telepathic species hadn't completely disappeared, but they were fading with each generation. Emma activated her personal log, recording thoughts that would be archived for future historians. Today we begin our first joint exploration mission beyond charted space. 50 cadets representing 20 different species, all heading into the unknown together. My grandfather once told me that humanity's greatest strength was our refusal to be quiet, but I think it's more than that. Our strength is our willingness to be loud enough for everyone else to find their voice too. The exploration mission launched the next morning, heading toward regions of space that no civilization had yet mapped. The crew worked together seamlessly, telepaths and non-telepaths coordinating through the new communication systems that made cooperation comfortable for everyone. When they encountered obstacles, they approached problems from multiple angles simultaneously, combining telepathic coordination with human creative chaos to find solutions neither could have achieved alone. Back on Earth, monuments had been built to honor those who died in the conflicts that transformed the galaxy. Cole's name was carved in stone alongside thousands of others, humans and aliens who had sacrificed everything for a future they would never see. People visited these monuments to remember that the freedom they enjoyed had been paid for in blood and determination. But the monuments weren't just about mourning loss. They were about celebrating what had been gained. The galaxy had learned that consciousness could take many forms. That different wasn't wrong. That chaos and